My name is Rabbi Stephen Leon, and this is our podcast, The Secret Jews of the Southwest. This particular podcast is going to talk about the life cycle of the Jew. I have another name from it, from womb to tomb. And the purpose of this podcast is not only for the secret Jews of the Southwest, but for all people to learn a little bit about Jewish traditions, the sources of those Jewish traditions, and for crypto Jews, some of these practices that have been going on really from the beginning of Judaism until the present day, and some of them that you may be familiar with that perhaps remind you of things that maybe your grandparents used to do, or things that you have read about, or things that you have seen, to see that if you can find in your life a connection. This is, again, all about connection. So let's start at the beginning of the life of a person, and that, of course, is birth. Now, birth is actually related directly to marriage, because in the Jewish tradition, the concept that is found even before Judaism existed, it's a godly concept. When Adam and Eve came together, obviously there was no one to perform their marriage, but they were married, Adam and Eve, symbolically at least. The first commandment in the book of Genesis says, Peru orvu, which means be fruitful and multiply. Now this continued in the generation of Noah, in the generation of the first Hebrew, the first Jew, Abraham, and it continues until this very day. In other words, one of the purposes of marriage is to have children. Now, having said that, I would like also to talk about this whole concept of being fruitful and multiply with some of the very controversial issues that come back to haunt us in this very modern day in which we live. Namely, what does Judaism say about abortion? What does Judaism say about contraception? And I think that that is very significant. It's very controversial today in other faiths and in politics as well. So again, going back to the original commandment from God, Peru orvu, be fruitful and multiply, does that mean that you cannot practice contraception? And if you can practice contraception, how is it practiced that is within the tradition and laws of Judaism? Well, some branches of, you have to understand also that there are different approaches in Judaism based on one's affiliation with a particular branch of our faith. For example, the most traditional is Orthodox. They follow basically to the letter of the law without very little movement for going a little bit to the more liberal side. But even within Orthodoxy, you have interpretations of Orthodoxy. In Israel, for example, the ultra-Orthodox, the ones that even follow the more traditional laws, are often called Haredim. The only way I can translate that is ultra-Orthodox, more sticking to the law. Then the middle group of Judaism, ever since it became part of the Jewish scene, is called conservative Judaism, which basically follows the law, but in a modern framework. The most liberal is called Reform, and very often in Reform, as long as you follow the spirit of the law, you don't necessarily have to follow the literal law. And I'm being very loose in my interpretation. Others will disagree with me, but I just wanted to give you a point of focus where to understand this. So let's go back to contraception. So I would say that there is a branch of Judaism that says under no circumstances, no form of contraception is acceptable. And then you would have another group that would say, well, in the case, let's suppose the life of the mother is in danger. If medical science, if a physician says, if this woman were to conceive, then her life would be in danger, then contraception would absolutely be practiced. And there was a modern Orthodox rabbi who said, Peru orvu, you could take it literally. I don't really like this interpretation, but if you have a male child and then a female child, if you have both, then you can practice contraception. Again, a lot of this is interpretation. So let's go back to whatever the circumstances are where contraception is permissible. I'll give you another example. If the physical well-being of a woman is something that has to be considered, what about the psychological well-being of the woman? That's another thing. If a woman cannot deal with getting pregnant, psychologically, if it would damage her ability to function in the world, would then it be permissible? Another possibility, what about the husband, etc.? And people could argue, well, you could always have your child up for adoption, etc., etc. But contraception in Judaism is permissible under certain circumstances. Now, once again, we have to come back to how it is practiced. Actually, according to the most traditional aspect, there are times when impurity is something which would prohibit a female from participating in a particular ritual. I won't go into each of these rituals, but she would be considered, tamei, impure, let's say when she was having her period, for example. Now, most people say, well, a male doesn't have that prohibition. Actually, it does say in the Torah, if a male spills his seed without having intercourse, in other words, it wasn't for the purpose of peru or vu, be fruitful and multiply, then he is impure until he does something about it. By the way, the same thing with the woman. After she has her period, waits a week, and then she goes to the mikveh, which is a ritual bath. The same thing with a male. The truth of the matter is, if a male is considered impure, then he would have to go to a ritual bath and then be pure again. So this idea of impurity does fall into the category of peru or vu, because for a male, even more so than for a female, would be if he spills his seed, if he withdraws during sexual relations, etc., then he would be in violation of that law. Having said that, because of that rule, most of the rabbinical sources say that if contraception is permitted for medical reasons, psychological reasons, etc., only the male may be allowed to practice the contraception by using a condom. Well, then you would argue, but if you're using a condom, what about the fact that he's spilling a seed? So it is a very complicated in areas. You will find most rabbinical sources say, if you're in doubt, consult your rabbi. Well, this is a very, very delicate area of a person's life. And I'm not saying that they all do this, but what I really want to conclude in this part is that contraception in Judaism, unlike certain other faiths, is permissible under certain circumstances. The next area, which is also related, is abortion. One of the things about Judaism is that a fetus is not considered a viable living creature until that fetus is actually a baby and lives outside of the womb for however long that might be. That is a viable. So again, if a woman does get pregnant, and if, let's go back to the same rules, whether it's physiological, whether it is psychological, there's a very controversial issue going on today, even in the state of Texas, where I'm broadcasting this, because there is a situation of a woman who is pregnant. The laws of Texas are very strict. This is not a Jewish case. This is just a political case or legal case, a secular legal case. And basically, if she has this abortion, even though her physician said that her life could be in danger, that the child's illness, what's wrong with the child, would ultimately result in a very short pregnancy, and more importantly, that she would never be able to have a child again. A judge in Texas said in that circumstance, the abortion was permissible, and now the Attorney General is saying, no, it's not. So she's going to another state to have the abortion. But that's why it's so controversial. There are many states today where it's literally impossible to have an abortion. From a Jewish perspective, an abortion is definitely permissible under certain circumstances. And that's very, very important for people to realize. I don't have to go through every single one of those, but what I'm saying is, in Judaism, unlike other faiths, an abortion is permissible under certain circumstances. Another thing that we as Jews believe is separation of church and state. In fact, it even says in the Talmud that dina malchuta kadina, which means the law of the state can, under certain circumstances, take precedence over a religious law. Not in every case. I'll give you one example. I'm going to fast forward to death. In Judaism, we don't embalm a body. I'll get to that when we talk more about death. But suppose in a certain situation, maybe you're transporting a body from one country to another, or for other reasons, the contamination and things like that. If the state says in those cases you must embalm, Judaism would go along with it. It might disagree, but it ultimately would agree if those are not prejudicial. It wasn't because of anti-Semitism that the law is enacted. So again, just very quickly, both contraception and abortion are permissible under certain circumstances in Judaism. Okay, having gotten that out of the way, now let's talk about the actual birth of children. In the case of a male child on the 8th day after birth is required to have a circumcision. In Hebrew, we call that a brit milah. And that goes all the way back to Abraham, who was commanded, and this is a graphic that you really have to use a little bit of imagination and caution. He had no one else to do this. He had to circumcise himself and then circumcise his child on the 8th day. Now, the reason for this may later on have turned on that it was a very positive thing to be done hygienically and that there was a medical advantage to that. Not every physician would agree, but many of them do agree. Of circumcision, for example, we learn that males who are circumcised have a less tendency of spreading AIDS, for example. But the reason for this was more based on theology. Remember that Judaism emanated from paganism. Abraham is the first to come to the belief in God. And what we learned is that the pagans worshipped the male sexual organ, that they had idols in the shape of the male sexual organ that they worshipped. They basically worshipped sex. If you look at what the idolaters did in terms of their sexual behavior, there were no rules whatsoever. There was pedophilia, it wasn't called that. It was a practice to have sexual relations with children. There was a practice to have sexual relations with other relatives, to have sexual relations basically with whomever you wanted and whenever you wanted, because even animals. Why? Because people worshiped sex. And all of this can be documented. And so a sign to be cautious of that was the circumcision, which involved basically taking a piece of flesh from the foreskin of the male sexual organ. Today, we have people who are trained to do that. It could be a physician or a urologist, but there are also rabbis and other religious Jews who have learned the skill of what was called being a mohel. In Yiddish, they pronounce it a moil. That is a person who specializes in performing this circumcision on a male child. And at that circumcision on the 8th day, why the 8th day? Because 7 days of creation, and just to give an extra day that it should not be until the child is physically healthy, on the 8th day was when the circumcision was done by a mohel or a moil. And once again, there are exceptions. What happens if child is a hemophiliac? So there are other physical reasons why a circumcision could not be performed. We never endanger the life of a child, or actually the life of anyone. But specifically here, we're talking about children. And so in certain cases, even that would be under discussion, despite the commandment to circumcise a child on the 8th day. At that circumcision, by the way, and I'm going to talk about the service of the circumcision, what is called, in Yiddish they call it a bris. In Hebrew it's called a brit milah. And at that service, there are certain honors given. One of them is, it's actually an Aramaic Greek word, a sandik. A sandik is the person who has the honor of holding the child when the mohel does the circumcision. It's usually given to an elderly, honored person in the family, could be a grandfather, or it doesn't necessarily have to be that person, and that is one of the honors. The other honor I'll talk about, because I'm going to talk about naming a daughter, who obviously doesn't require a circumcision, and there are certain traditions that go to both the naming of a girl as well as the naming of a boy. But at the circumcision, we have the sandik, has a particular role. And that is basically what happens at a circumcision. Certain prayers are said. And actually, because Abraham circumcised his son, during the ceremony, the father actually gives the mohel permission to act as his agent in circumcising his son, because he was actually the one that had the responsibility going back to biblical days. Now, what happens with a daughter? Again, the different traditions. The most traditional actually will name his daughter when we're called to the Torah, which during the week is done on Monday and Thursday or on Saturday morning. And there is no limitation. There's no 8 days. Just after the daughter is born, a member of the family, usually the father or the grandfather, comes to the synagogue and names the daughter. In the more liberal branches of Judaism, in what has happened over recent years, and that could be many, many years, is to give more equality to the girl's ceremony, as more honors have been given to women today, being called to the Torah, being included in the quorum of 10, the minyan, etc., etc. And so the girl's naming ceremony has often been very similar to the boys without the circumcision. Once again, it depends on the community. Having said that, now we get to the next part of it, and that is the naming of a male or a female in Judaism. And the practice, again, here we have a difference between the Sephardic Jews, the Jews from Spanish-speaking countries in the Middle East, and Ashkenazic Jews who come from Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Germany, etc. The difference is as follows. When you name in the Ashkenazic tradition, it is traditional to name, and I'm talking only in Hebrew now, it's traditional to name your child after a deceased relative. To name after a deceased relative basically rekindles that spark of memory and spirituality of that deceased relative, and you now give that to the child. In the Sephardic, it's just the opposite. It is actually considered impolite, inappropriate to name after a deceased relative. Rather, you should name after a living relative to give that adult honor. The Ashkenazi feel it's almost superstitious if you name after a living relative, because it's as if you're taking that potential soul before it dies, you're now taking it away from a living relative, etc. The truth of the matter is, those are just two traditions. You can find your own logic for them. The Ashkenazi after a deceased relative, and the Sephardic after a living relative. And what about the name itself? So the name itself in Hebrew is the important name. You know, we live in the modern age, and our children are going to interact in society. And again, it depends on how traditional that family is or the practices of that family. Some of them, and of course in Israel, you will probably give the same name in Hebrew as you do in English. But today, as I said, there are people that want to have a very current name in English, because outside of Israel, the Hebrew name is only used for ritual purposes. When a person is called to the Torah, when a person observes his or her bar bat mitzvah, when a person gets married, and at the end, when a person dies, the Hebrew name is used. And the Hebrew name is used, and then for a male, we say ben, the son of, for a girl, bat, the daughter of, and then we also include the Hebrew name of their parents, their father and their mother. Some people only use the father, others use the father and the mother. So, for example, I have a daughter, and her name actually is used both for her Hebrew name and for her, for lack of a better term, her secular name, and that is Shoshana. So Shoshana is the daughter, bat, of my name. My Hebrew name is Tzvi, and my wife's Hebrew name is Sharona. So she is Shoshana bat Tzvi v'Sharona. Let me also talk about another thing about names, especially in the Hasidic community, where Yiddish, and you know Yiddish again is a form of communication based on Hebrew plus Eastern European languages, but written in Hebrew letters, as Ladino for the Sephardic Jews is a language made up of Spanish, Hebrew, other dialects of Sephardic languages, and people have Ladino names. But more in the Ashkenazi community, some people, for example, might name a child. The other day I had a funeral, and the name of the person that died was Shendel. That is definitely a Yiddish name. Very often in the Hasidic community, they name after some of the Hasidic leaders who had Yiddish names. So again, some of these traditions are based on a person's background, where they came from, etc. Another thing about the naming, however, as I said, is some people use the modern secular name in order to have that person be more in the, let's say, the modern community. So you can have, for example, a girl named Ashley. Ashley is not particularly a Hebrew name, but let's say the family named the child in the Sephardic or in the Ashkenaz after a living or deceased relative, and maybe her name is something like Ahuva, which means beloved. Those are just examples. And by the way, it isn't necessary in either case to name in memory or in honor of someone. That is not necessary. You can simply name in Hebrew, and this is done often in Israel, just because you like the name of the child. Some people also use the Bible to name. For example, someone might name the child Moshe after Moses or Abraham after Abraham. And then there is another myth that the letter of the Hebrew name has to correspond with the letter of the English name. For example, let's say someone's name is Drew. Someone's English name is Drew. Does it mean that their Hebrew name has to be starting with the Hebrew letter Dalet, which corresponds to the English D? No, it doesn't necessarily have to do that. In addition to the naming, we have other honors that are given, and that is to the godfather and the godmother. And let me just explain. Some people do this just as a point of honoring somebody, let's say a friend of the family, a relative of the family, someone that the parents are very close with. But historically, the role of the godfather and the godmother was much more significant. And some people today will do that, will have a legal document setting this up. But just from a religious point of view, the role of the godfather and the godmother was, God forbid something happens to the parents during a person's childhood, you would want to select in advance who you would want to raise your children. God forbid something happens to you. That was the real role of the godfather and the godmother. Today it is more symbolic. It's more of an honorary than anything else. We're coming to sort of the end of this, and I'd like to close with a song that was written by someone that I knew very well who's passed on. His name is Moshe Yes, and he wrote this song that if you had a male child, and it goes like this. And that's your boy, that's your little boy, with the rabbis all around him, that's your boy. He's 8 days old, he's 8 days old, with the rabbi and the mohel, he's 8 days old. We make a kiddush on the wine, and we say a little prayer, and we pray that God will keep him from harm. We make a kiddush on the wine, and we say a little prayer, and we pray that God will keep him well. That song can continue through the other life cycle events, which we will do in further podcasts. By the way, I recommend this podcast for people who are coming back to Judaism or people who have lapsed in their Judaism and they want to learn. Some of the podcasts have been on Jewish holidays and some of them on other practices. But we're starting this one of the life cycle of a Jew. I welcome your questions, by the way. You can always email me at rabbisal@aol.com and connect with us through the Anusim Center website. Again, I hope that you will share this with other people who want to learn about the life cycle of the Jew. It's a very, very special way for our people to live their lives, and especially for the secret Jews of the Southwest to learn about this. Thank you so much for your participation, and shalom.